When people hear the phrase Linux didn't improve, Windows fell behind, it sounds provocative, almost like clickbait, but the more you sit with it, the more it starts to feel uncomfortably accurate. Because this isn't really a story about Linux suddenly becoming something radically new. It's a story about expectations, momentum, and a slow but very visible shift in what people consider normal, acceptable, and future-proof in an operating system. Linux didn't wake up one morning and decide to out-innovate Windows. It just kept moving forward at a steady, sometimes boring pace, while Windows, weighed down by its own legacy, business priorities, and contradictions, started missing steps. And over time, those missed steps added up. For decades, Windows was the default. Not the best, not the cleanest, not the most elegant, but the default. You bought a PC, it ran Windows. You installed software, it was written for Windows first. Hardware manufacturers tested on Windows first. IT departments standardized on Windows because everyone else already did. That dominance created an assumption that Windows would always be good enough, that whatever flaws it had were simply the cost of compatibility and ubiquity. Linux, on the other hand, lived in a different world. It didn't have the luxury of being good enough. It had to be better in specific ways just to survive. Early Linux was rough, no question. Installation was intimidating. Hardware support was inconsistent, and the desktop experience often felt like a collection of loosely connected ideas rather than a cohesive product. But Linux users accepted that because Linux wasn't trying to be everything to everyone. It was trying to be correct, flexible, transparent, and adaptable. That mindset never really changed, and that's important. Linux didn't chase trends aggressively. It didn't try to reinvent itself every few years to impress shareholders. It just kept refining the same core principles: modularity, openness, user control, and long-term stability. Meanwhile, Windows evolved in a very different direction. As Microsoft grew into a services company, Windows stopped being the product and became the platform for other products. Telemetry, cloud integration, subscriptions, accounts, and data collection slowly moved from optional extras to baked-in assumptions. Each individual change was defensible. Telemetry improves quality. Cloud sync is convenient. Accounts enable cross-device experiences, but taken together, they transformed Windows from a tool you own into an environment you rent, negotiate with, and constantly reconfirm your consent to use. Linux didn't need to improve to compete with that shift. It just needed to not make the same trade-offs. One of the clearest examples is system performance. Modern Windows machines are powerful beyond what most users actually need. Yet many people still experience sluggish boot times, background activity, random spikes in disk or CPU usage, and fans spinning up for no obvious reason. Over time, users internalize this as normal. Windows just does that. Linux, running on the same hardware, often feels lighter, more predictable, and more responsive. Not because Linux suddenly became magical, but because it never normalized waste in the first place. When Linux users say their system feels fast on old hardware, that isn't a flex, it's an indictment. Then there's updates, a topic that perfectly encapsulates the Windows fell behind argument. Windows updates are infamous. Forced restarts, updates at inconvenient times, updates that break drivers, updates that change settings without asking, updates that reinstall apps you removed, updates that add features you didn't request. Again, each decision had a rationale. Security matters, consistency matters. But the user experience became adversarial. The system updates itself despite you, not with you. Linux updates, by contrast, didn't radically change. Package managers got faster, dependency handling improved, and graphical update tools became friendlier, but the underlying philosophy stayed intact. Updates are explicit. You initiate them, you can inspect them, you can delay them, you can roll them back. Linux didn't improve here. Windows regressed relative to user trust. Privacy is another area where the gap widened without Linux doing anything dramatic. Linux has always been transparent by necessity. The code is open. Network activity is inspectable. Services are optional. On Windows, privacy became something you configure defensively. You don't ask what Windows does. You ask what Windows is allowed to do. Settings panels ballooned with toggles that attempt to reassure users without fundamentally changing the data-hungry architecture underneath. For many users, especially those becoming more privacy-aware, Linux didn't suddenly become appealing. Windows became uncomfortable. Software distribution tells a similar story. Linux package managers have existed for decades. They were once criticized as fragmented and confusing, and in some ways they were. Different distros, different repositories, different philosophies. But the core idea was solid. A centralized, trusted source for software, dependency resolution, handled automatically, and updates integrated into the system. Windows resisted this model for a long time, relying instead on individual installers, bundled updaters, and third-party mechanisms. Only recently did Microsoft start pushing the Microsoft Store and tools like Wingit, effectively reinventing concepts Linux users had normalized years ago. That's not Windows catching up because Linux improved. That's Windows realizing too late that the old way didn't scale. Development workflows highlight this even more starkly. Linux became the default environment for servers, containers, cloud infrastructure, and modern development stacks. Tools were built with Linux in mind, first because Linux was predictable, scriptable, and close to production environments. Windows responded with WSL, which is genuinely impressive, but also revealing. The solution to Windows not being good enough for modern development was to run Linux inside Windows. That alone tells you everything. Linux didn't need to improve. Windows had to admit defeat in that domain. Even at the desktop level, where Windows traditionally dominated, the story repeats. Desktop Linux didn't suddenly become flawless. It still has rough edges. But desktop Windows accumulated friction, ads in the start menu, recommendations that feel like promotions, default apps that are harder to change, online accounts pushed aggressively during setup, features tied to subscriptions. Linux desktops, despite their variety and occasional inconsistency, generally respect one boundary Windows increasingly crosses. They don't assume you are the product. Stability is another quiet but powerful contrast. Linux distributions often offer clear choices between cutting-edge and long-term support. You know what you're getting. Windows blurs those lines. Feature updates roll out on schedules that feel arbitrary, sometimes introducing breaking changes under the guise of routine maintenance. Enterprises mitigate this with versions like LTSC, but that itself is telling. The best Windows experience is the one most consumers aren't allowed to use. Hardware support flips the narrative even further. Windows used to be synonymous with hardware compatibility. Plug something in, it works. Over time, driver models changed, vendors cut corners, and compatibility issues became more common, especially with older devices. Linux, through community-driven drivers and kernel integration, often supports hardware long after Windows drops official support. When users install Linux on machines declared obsolete by Windows requirements and find everything working smoothly, it doesn't feel like Linux improving. It feels like Windows giving up. The Windows 11 hardware requirements were a turning point for many. TPM requirements, CPU whitelists, artificial cutoffs that excluded perfectly capable machines. From Microsoft's perspective, this was about security and future readiness. From the user's perspective, it was forced obsolescence. Linux didn't need a marketing campaign to benefit from that decision. It simply remained installable. In that moment, Linux didn't look advanced. Windows looked restrictive. Even the philosophy of ownership shifted. With Linux, you own your system. You decide how it behaves, what it runs, when it updates, and how it communicates. With Windows, ownership became conditional. You own the hardware, but the software asserts its own priorities. This difference didn't emerge overnight. It grew slowly, almost invisibly, until users started articulating a vague sense of discomfort. Linux didn't improve that feeling. Windows created it. What's fascinating is that many of these issues aren't about technical capability. Microsoft has brilliant engineers. Windows can be fast, secure, and flexible. The problem is incentives. Windows must serve advertisers, partners, services, and shareholders. Linux serves its users and contributors first, even when that slows things down or fragments the ecosystem. That trade-off used to make Linux feel unpolished. Now, it makes Windows feel compromised. Gaming is often cited as the final frontier, and even there the pattern holds. Linux gaming improved, yes, but largely through compatibility layers like Proton. The real shift was that Windows gaming became more bloated, more tied to launchers, accounts, DRM, and background services. Linux didn't need native ports for everything to feel viable. Windows made gaming feel heavier than it needed to be. So when people say Linux caught up, they're missing the point. Linux didn't chase Windows. Windows moved away from the things that made it attractive in the first place: simplicity, predictability, user control, performance without explanation. Linux just stayed where it was, refining around those values while the ground under Windows shifted. This is why the conversation today feels different from 10 or 15 years ago. Back then, recommending Linux felt like evangelism. Today, it often feels like a practical suggestion. Not because Linux is perfect, but because Windows has accumulated enough friction that alternatives feel reasonable. That's not a victory born of rapid improvement. It's a consequence of divergence. And maybe the most telling sign is emotional. Users frustrated with Windows often describe feeling powerless. Settings revert, updates interrupt, features appear uninvited. In Linux communities, frustration exists too, but it's different. It's about bugs, design choices, or compatibility, not about being overridden by your own system. That emotional difference matters more than benchmarks or feature lists. In the end, Linux didn't improve. Windows fell behind isn't an insult to Windows or blind praise for Linux. It's an observation about direction. Linux stayed aligned with its original purpose. Windows slowly drifted away from its users. And when two paths diverge long enough, the one that didn't change can end up looking like the future, while the one that did looks strangely outdated. Not obsolete in the sense of unusable, but obsolete in mindset. An operating system that assumes control over the user instead of serving them. Linux didn't need to reinvent itself to expose that. Windows did it all on its own.